Hello and welcome to the Kilkenny Arts Festival online. And I'm joined for our conversation today by Samantha Power, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author who served as the 28th United States Ambassador to the United Nations from 2013 to 2017 under Barack Obama. She's now professor at the JFK School of Government at Harvard and at the Harvard Law School. She won a Pulitzer Prize for her book about the war in Bosnia, A Problem from Hell, and she's recently published a memoir, The Education of an Idealist. Ambassador, in that memoir, you describe how your parents' marriage in Ireland broke up and you emigrated with your mother to the United States. Did you always think you'd see your father again?
Thank you for that question. Piercing question right off the bat. I'll get right back to it. May I first just say thank you, Olivia, for doing this, and thank you to the Kilkenny Arts Festival for keeping the flame alive, culture alive. I have very fond memories of being there in person, and it's the first time I was ever interviewed by Fintan O'Toole. I should have learned my lesson the first time and never allowed myself to do it again, but had a great time in Kilkenny and have learned subsequently about a very close family connection I have to the area, which is that my grandfather, who I knew well, Nick Delaney, his first cousin was Nixie Boren, who was one of the great crusaders on behalf of minor rights and worker rights from Castlecomer. It was amazing to go back and to learn that, having thought I came from a kind of apolitical family, that there was this remarkable driver of social change and promoter of human rights, indefatigable, relentless descendant of mine. And I learned it through the RT program, Who Do You Think You Are? So
there were idealists.
Working on a memoir, I had no idea that I had this connection to the area and to such an important figure in Irish history and in human rights history, really. But to your question, I don't know if one can generalize about kids across the board, but certainly until you've experienced a big rupture, a big shock to the system, there is, if you're lucky anyway, you can grow up just thinking that what is will always be, and I think that was my sense. Yes, my dad was a big drinker. Yes, when I lived in Ireland before I was 9 and my mother moved me to America, I spent a disproportionate share of my youth in the basement of Hartigan's pub. Yes, I knew my mother was leaving my father because of the drink, but everybody, it seemed to my young eyes and ears, seemed to drink. And there were lots of other fathers in the pub, fewer mothers, and lots of other kids hanging out in the pub, playing board games, Chutes and Ladders with me, down in the basement, or reading their Hardy Boys mysteries as I was reading Nancy Drew. And so it just, what is, and the idea that this could give rise, to something that was fatal, it never entered my mind. So when Mom moved my younger brother and me to America and got licensed somehow from the Irish Supreme Court to do so, and I lived in America, and suddenly the buildings were big and the sports were different, but I could learn about them. And it felt like on one level I could have the best of both worlds, that my father was still in Ireland, but we would go back every holiday, starting with the very first Christmas, to go back and to be with him. Summers would be in Ireland. I'd see my school friends. I thought it was kind of hybrid life, I think. I mean, to the degree that I thought about it at all. And so when, at age 14, I got the call that my father had died, that the alcoholism had ravaged him in ways that, so many people know so well. It was just a lightning bolt, that came out of the sky that was completely unexpected. So, and it's really, to this day, it's funny, I just took my son Declan to a coffee shop just an hour ago to get him breakfast to celebrate. He had a great baseball game last night, so I took him out for breakfast. And because of COVID, I was allowed to go into the restaurant, and then you were allowed to go and sit outside. But once you went outside, you had to loop the whole building to come back in. Like, everything is all different. The restaurants are open now, but everything is a little bit different. And so Declan was waiting outside. I was waiting for his food to come inside, and he was waiting outside. And I went outside, and he was gone at one point. I had been looking at it out the window, making sure, and he was gone. And I don't know. I think every parent panics when my son's 11, when something like that happens. But I'm not sure everyone goes into full-on 911. We're in this very bucolic, nice coffee shop. It's very unlikely. Like most people would maybe run the statistics, but for me, it was certain doom an hour ago. And in fact, he was wandering around looking for birds that were descending on the picnic table and so forth, and everything was fine. But I think it's a searing. It's the shock, and it's the idea that love alone doesn't keep people around, that just no matter how much they light up your life, like there are demons and there are happenings and tragedies that just strike, out of nowhere. And the good part about it is I'm a very smell the roses kind of, we go around at dinner and say, what are we grateful for? And it does leave you kind of wanting to savor what you have, I think, but it has a scarring quality, of course, as well.
Yeah, it does. And it must have struck you how lovely it might have been for him to have known that his daughter had become the United States ambassador to the UN. I mean, that must have struck you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even when his friends come out of the woodwork and, old UCD colleagues of his or Hartigan's pub dwellers with him would come to my events, I kind of basically lose it each time. And you don't know, again, how close to the surface some of that, all of that still remains. But yeah, I mean, he would sit in Hartigan's, idle though he was on one definition, with the stack of Irish and English newspapers and just plow through them. And, once I started reading the newspaper, which was late in life and into my 20s, I would do the same thing, but I never knew, or I never had any conscious memory that that's something that he would do. So I would get all the American newspapers plus the Financial Times and the Guardian. And I would, go to local diner, local bar and read my stack. And then my father's sister told me once, Jimmy used to do the exact same. And, so I just think
that's a nice thing to know, though, isn't it? It's a nice thing to realize that quite unconsciously you'd picked up some of his habits.
Yeah, no, for sure. He was the most political, other than Nixie Boren, who I learned about later, he was the most political person in the family, with full of opinions and sounding off. And I hope I have a little more humility than my dad did, but he was grounded in just being an omnivore for what was happening in the world.
Well, you quite early on in your career covered the Bosnian war. Was it the coverage of that war that gave you the determination to fight genocide? Because that's been a sort of a leitmotif of your work right along.
Yeah, I mean, it was a formative experience. I went to the Balkans about a year into the Bosnian War in 1993 in the summer, because by coincidence I got an internship out of college working for somebody who'd been a U.S. official for 3.5 decades, but who had retreated to run what's called a think tank, one of these policy think tanks. And this man, former ambassador, was consumed with what was happening there. So had I not worked for him, had he not found this the ultimate test of the post-Cold War order, and had he not tasked me to pour him coffee at events that were related to Bosnia, where speakers came and told of concentration camps and atrocities, I don't know even to this day what direction my career would have gone in, but I was mentored by him, and I was exposed to all of that right out of university. And so I went over as a freelance correspondent. And it's true. I mean, even when I was at the UN as a member of President Obama's cabinet, in this kind of crazy position of privilege, and later in life, like so many of the issues that came before me were ones that I first got exposure to at that very young age, at such, again, so formative. So whether that was the limits of humanitarian assistance, when you the symptoms of conflict rather than dealing with root causes, whether that was the strengths and weaknesses of the UN, the strength bringing all the countries and the stakeholders together and there being one building, one place where all of that can happen. But of course, the weakness when the big powers are standing off, or when major powers want to stand on the sidelines. I mean, it can be either scenario can really undermine what the UN per se can do out in the world. And then ethnic cleansing, mass atrocities. One thing that's interesting that I really only struck me hard when I was working on the memoir was the extent to which, in my early 20s, after the Berlin Wall had fallen, after the Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union had collapsed, just what optimism there was. And Bosnia, this thing that I was exposed to and witnessing and the suffering of these people, just seemed like this last gasp of nationalism and xenophobia and ethnic baiting and fear mongering. It just felt like this relic from another age. Yeah. And when I look back now, so many of the tactics and the devices that the leaders were using in that conflict to really, I mean, some people started with pre-existing animus toward Muslims or Croats or whatever, but many were led to that place by being convinced that if they didn't kill, they would be killed, and the manipulation of media and the attacks on independent voices and the sort of divisiveness and the pitting one group against another to preserve, for the sake of the politicians, to preserve their own power. So when I'm going back over Bosnia here now in Trump land, from the standpoint of having left the Obama administration and witnessing so many of the tactics, experiencing so many of the tactics that Trump is employing, thinking, oh my gosh, it wasn't a relic, it was an omen, right, of what would happen if we didn't stay vigilant against these kinds of threats.
Well, in your time at the UN, and we all watched with great care when we saw you there, because you've always worn your heart in your sleeve about things. I remember particularly in 2012 and 2013, I mean, President Obama had made it very clear that if the Syrian regime, if President Assad used chemical weapons against his people, that was a red line for the United States. And then there was an attack, as we know, in August 2013 on the Damascus suburbs, when chemical weapons were indeed used. And Obama decided he would need Congress to back him if, in fact, he was going to order airstrikes. Do you think he should have ordered them anyway?
I'm really torn about that. I mean, it's very hard to look back on that period and not just view it as a turning point. Certainly, it's a turning point in the conflict in Syria, which was already horrific in terms of the death toll at that time. I think was 150,000 or 200,000, but today it's more than 500,000 people have been killed. But also because in the wake of the perception, and I'll come to the reality, which is a little more complicated, but nonetheless, the perception comes from a reasonable place. But this perception that Obama wasn't prepared to go further in Syria, that he was all talk, let's say, some people saying he was all talk and not enough action. There was an emboldenedness to Assad and to Putin, I think, in the region. You really saw them take the gloves off. And initially, we were able to dismantle the chemical weapons program because of the threat of force that Obama had levied. And I worked with my Russian counterpart to get that done. And it was really important. It would become even more important because ISIS at that time wasn't actually at large, but would rise within a year or two. And had we not dismantled the Syrian government's chemical weapons program, those weapons would have been available to ISIS. And Lord knows what would have happened, whether in Syria or anywhere in Europe or beyond. So something positive came out of it, but it was an inflection point where Assad just said, there's so little enthusiasm in the United States to be embroiled, understandably, to be embroiled in the Middle East, and such fear that if you do something small, it's going to lead to mission creep, that I can get away with anything. I think that, and you just saw whether it was use of incendiary weapons or napalm, or then using chlorine, a household substance, as a chemical and in violation of the U.S.-Russian agreement that dismantled the larger program. So, and what does that then give rise to? It gives rise to massive refugee flows initially they stay confined within Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and then it's unleashed. And all across Europe, you see people in 2014, 2015 fleeing. And then, look at Brexit. Would Brexit have happened, something settled by such a narrow margin? Would Trump have won in an election settled by 78,000 votes? But for this migration, immigration, those issues, which the Brexiteers and the Trumpies really sort of played upon. So how do I not look back and say, well, I wish he'd gone forward? I think it would have been very challenging to go forward in part because, and I was in Ireland when the chemical weapons attack occurred, our closest allies were opposed to using military force. The only country by our side was France. And in Congress, we couldn't even get the Democrats, who had been strong supporters of President Obama, to stand with him because the American people were so opposed. And so I do think some limited airstrikes over a bounded period of time at least could have deterred future use. But fundamentally, the war in Iraq has cast such a shadow, and rightly so, and injected an appropriate dose of humility about what military force can achieve, that I don't want to, yes, I think he should have gone forward, consistent with American law, because he was able to go forward for without congressional authorization. I think he could have and should have done that. But I can't look at you and say that that would have changed Assad or Putin's calculus in the long term. It just had a chance, at least, of energizing diplomacy. Really stagnated by that time, and really between that period, 2013, and when we left office in 2017, we never recovered momentum around what we know is actually needed to end the conflict and end the suffering, which is a political solution. So without that leverage, those diplomatic talks had a kind of flaccid feel. There was just not a sense that we could get traction.
Because it might have made some difference. It mightn't have stopped the war.
Right.
But it could have made some difference to thousands of people.
It could have. Here's what I'll say: is pulling back may have done more harm than striking would have done good, if you know what I mean. Insofar as because the very way that, even though we did dismantle the program, by going to Congress and showing, for lack of a better word, the bad guys, the rogue actors in the world, like Assad, in showing that the commander-in-chief couldn't summon the votes on behalf of what he deemed a national security imperative, the use of chemical weapons in a large scale, that was an exposure about how tired America was. And so that, may have affected, it's very hard to measure these things, but may have affected people's calculuses going forward.
However, he did step in Iraq to help the Yazidis, the Kurdish-speaking minority group in Iraq, who at one stage were trapped without food or water near Mount Sinjar in 2014. He did step in to help there.
He did, indeed. I think from his... Are we frozen? Sorry.
No, we're fine.
Okay, sorry. He did. I think, what he would tell you, and he has a book coming out one day soon, so hopefully he'll address some of this in those pages from his own perspective. But I think President Obama was never, you come back to sort of the dawn of his political career when he was in a Senate race that people didn't really think he had a chance to win, namely the Senate race in Illinois. And he came out at a time when the Iraq War was massively popular. It's hard to remember now that it could have been, but it was across Democrats and Republicans alike. And he came out and really risked arguably his political career and said, I'm against this war. This is a dumb war, but I'm not against all uses of force. I'm not against all wars. If you can show, if the benefits, in using this dangerous, hazardous instrument of U.S. power, if the benefits outweigh the costs, that's different. But that's not the case here, where the cause is the predicate for war is unreliable. The consequences have not been thought through. We're isolated in the world. I give you that history, not that it's directly relevant to the fate of the Yazidis, but it's that same kind of consequentialist calculus, I think, that he made with regard to the Yazidis. We were already involved in Iraq in battling ISIS. So it wasn't like you were breaking the seal and introducing a new theater where you need to get new intelligence and so forth. It was a discrete task that when his commanders came to him and said, "This is how I think we can do it, Mr. President, and we can continue the fight against ISIS. Indeed, by rescuing the Yazidis, we will also be maintaining that fight. This is a theater of ISIS's effort to take over more territory and build their caliphate in Iraq and Syria." But it was really that he felt that the means were proportional to the ends and that he could get something done. And that on Syria, those of us who were arguing for no-fly zones or civilian protection areas and so forth, we were never able to persuade him that what started as limited, which is how we would have intended it, was going to remain limited. And that was in part because Russia was in, Iran was in on the side of the Assad regime. Nobody's backing ISIS other than the most nefarious, dark figures. They don't have full-on state power behind them. And so I think he thought he could rescue those people. And believe me, if he could have rescued the Syrians, if we had presented a pathway to him that he felt, was minimal, acceptable cost for which we could get domestic buy-in, at least substantial domestic buy-in. Not everybody, Republicans are going to oppose whatever he wants, but at least that of his own party. I think he would have been persuaded in that direction. But for the Yazidi discrete mission that he could get done.
Yeah. Was he, in your experience, an overly cautious president?
He was immensely decisive. And I think there's a conflation because people are used to American presidents being quite quick to the draw, quite quick to pull the military tool out of the toolbox. So even among people, it's kind of odd, but even among people who have long lamented the fact that the U.S. over-relies on military force in its leadership abroad, sometimes I think fall prey to the tendency to conflate Obama's skepticism about military force being able to solve problems abroad, conflate that with, he's too cautious. I mean, he wasn't cautious when he had a read on bin Laden, even though half his cabinet said it probably might not be bin Laden and you shouldn't do it. He was not cautious when ISIS took over Iraq, even though we'd withdrawn from Iraq. I mean, you could see another individual looking at the domestic politics and thinking nobody wants war, in the Middle East anymore. Why go back? That was not an option, right? It was ISIS. They were spreading their foothold and all throughout the region, and also radicalizing people in countries like yours and mine. And he wasn't cautious in terms of normalizing relations with Cuba or breaking the seal on engaging the Islamic Republic of Iran, which, if you heard the kinds of meetings we had internally about that, so many people just arguing like Congress will collapse. There will be uproar. I mean, these taboos in American foreign policy are really entrenched, or had been really entrenched. And he wasn't cautious when West Africa was getting overrun with the Ebola virus in using the U.S. military, notwithstanding the opposition even of leading Democrats, but using the U.S. military to dispatch there to a very dangerous situation and to build Ebola treatment units in order to be able to break the back of the curve and support local people who are sacrificing so much to try to end the epidemic. So it really depends if your proxy for caution did he want to be very, very careful about sending U.S. forces abroad again? I think the answer is yes. He wants to be very careful about that.
But I suppose, hopes were very high, particularly when he made that great speech in Cairo about the US's relationship with the Muslim world. Hopes were high that there perhaps would have been more movement on the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And he himself had spoken about his personal commitment to that and to doing something about the intolerable situation of the Palestinian people. Was it a disappointment for you, and maybe for him too, that he did not manage to do more about that in his time?
Absolutely. And in the first term, this was something I saw a little bit from afar, only as his human rights advisor. We were supporting Palestinian schools, supporting the Palestinian Authority and their effort to, practice good governance and be in a position, when peace talks produced a deal, to be able to self-govern, as they do in the territory that they control. But fundamentally, nothing that the U.S. president and also the U.S. Congress did over the 8 years got the parties as close as they needed to get to take that step. And I was involved in the second term at the very end in abstaining on a settlements resolution that came about and a settlements resolution had been vetoed in the first term by my predecessor, Ambassador Rice, on President Obama's instruction. We're not freelancing. We followed his instructions in each case. And in the first term, the reason it was vetoed, what in large part was, number one, the UN, does put pays disproportionate attention to the Israel-Palestine situation relative to like North Korea, human rights situation, Syria. It's like 18-1 in terms of resolutions. And so there was an issue with the venue, but mainly it was, we're invested in these talks. We're doing it, through the peace process. We are going to seek to get this done as the broker, but working with the UN, working with the EU, working with the Russian Federation and the Quad. By the second term, those talks, John Kerry left everything on the negotiating floor, as it were, in trying to, through almost smoke and mirrors, it felt like at some time bring the parties together. But all that kept happening is, the Israelis kept building settlements. Of course, Hamas wasn't helping matters governing in Gaza and firing rockets at Israelis, which each time enhances the sense of insecurity, enhances the sense that the Palestinians writ large kind of can't be trusted. And nothing came of those talks. And so President Obama made the call, which was a very difficult call given the opposition in many quarters within the U.S. To doing things at the UN related to the Israel-Palestine cause, but to have me abstain on that settlements resolution. But even in that vote, it just felt there was a melancholy in the Security Council chamber. It was not the case that a mere vote was going to change the calculus, and we've seen in the last nearly 4 years of Trump just how much further, things have moved on the ground, how many more steps, more settlements have been built, how many more steps the Trump administration has taken that have taken away U.S. leverage actually for future negotiations, because, everything from moving the embassy to the Golan to, all of these kinds of steps, are the kinds of things that are in play in political negotiations. And so, and beyond that, to strip funding for Palestinian schools and UN relief and humanitarian organizations, just really, I think, has put the U.S. in a position where it's going to be very hard to recover trust. But
is it a disappointment for you that vote where the U.S. at least abstained, that was a message that could not have been sent earlier? Is it a disappointment to you that the abstention that happened in that vote, condemning the Israeli settlements, is it a disappointing situation for you that did not happen earlier? It was a very last minute.
No, it's a disappointment to me that we didn't move the parties closer to peace. It's a disappointment to me that we don't have a two-state solution. The picture Obama painted, actually not in the Cairo speech, but in a subsequent UN General Assembly scene, actually created the picture of I don't know if he said next year or in the future, we will come here and Palestine will have a seat within the United Nations after a negotiated settlement. That's the tragedy, right? Is, whether a vote, believe me, I've been a part of a lot of votes, at the UN Security Council, and the most effective votes enshrine something that both parties are willing to do. Yeah. Even what I mentioned, which proved on one level Pyrrhic, the Syria chemical weapons dismantling, For a time, Russia was serious about getting that done, and that resolution enshrined that seriousness. You could almost tell that, like, the parent, wanted to kind of punish the child and take away from the child the means that the child had to destroy, in that instance, his own people. When the Security Council is way out in front of what the parties themselves are willing to do, it tends not to have that big an effect. So I don't know that the timing of the resolution is the relevant factor. I mean, whether there was more that we could have done bilaterally to press the parties together, I think that's a very fair question, and something that if Vice President Biden wins, he's going to have to grapple with now, but unfortunately with many more facts created on the ground that make peace feel even more elusive today.
Well, since you've mentioned President, the presidential candidate, right. You almost said President Biden.
Go ahead. Let's coronate him now and have a happier couple months.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things one was conscious of watching Obama was that he was very good at policy, but maybe sometimes not as good as politics. I mean, he did end up in the situation where he didn't have control of what was going to happen in the House or in the Senate. From where you're sitting now, if indeed Joe Biden wins the presidential election, is it still not going to mean a lot if he doesn't also manage to win the House of Representatives and the Senate?
Your question is so important. Let me just say something.
I love when people say that, Samantha. It makes me feel great when people say that.
I know. Having been the interviewer, I know the feeling. But let me just quibble a little bit just with the characterization of Obama. But the soundness of your question is unassailable. But Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, and the rest of the Republican Party establishment decided very early into Obama's tenure that it was more important to them to defeat Obama, to block his agenda, than it was to cater to the needs of their constituents. And I know that sounds like, how can that be true? It's such a nakedly political and partisan statement. Just go back over the record and listen to the words out of John Boehner's mouth or Mitch McConnell's mouth. And these, by the way, today would be considered moderates in their party. But it really does take two to tango in American politics. We are such a divided country, not only divided by polarization and now a kind of virulent, almost like tribal party identity, but just divided like down the middle, 50-50 almost in terms of Republicans and Democrats. And so when a party decides to just effectively boycott governing, that's going to make getting the politics right a little bit challenging. So I don't think Obama's problem was that he didn't play enough golf with Mitch McConnell, or that and it's true, he didn't have a lot of patience for the small talk. I concede that point, but I think something more structural was at work. And we've seen, even if one might have been not sure if that was a sort of structural set of decisions at the time, I think the way we've seen the Republican Party act, since Trump's rise and through Trump's presidency, I think really bears out that this was, sort of hostile opposition, and irrespective of whether, Moody's downgraded our credit rating because Republicans wouldn't agree to raise the debt ceiling, irrespective, people lost health insurance. So I think it was challenging. Having said that, the Democratic Party lost a lot of state legislatures and governorships.
They did. What happened? Did they stop fighting? Have they forgotten how to fight? Have they forgotten how to work on the ground?
Who's the they? The Democrats?
Yeah.
Or
the Democrats? No,
I mean, I think it's sadly getting easier to remember what the climate was like in 2008, 2009. I mean, think of Ireland and the foreclosures and the construction sites and the banks and the layoffs. And I mean, that was America, across the nation. And even though Obama, I think, gets very high points for his handling of the financial crisis, the fallout from that in community after community out of that crisis, right through to the election of Trump was still felt as jobs that disappeared just didn't come back. And so even though job numbers went up, you had people who never returned to full-time work or to the dignity of work that they had felt before. I'm not blaming it only on that. I also think, that there's been a reckoning within the Democratic Party as to how the Republicans kind of ran the table on those, what we call down ballot races. We were so focused on the Senate races and the House races and so forth. And here, and in America, because of federalism, so much gets done at the state level. I mean, many of the issues related to racial injustice and policing, of course, are only going to be handled at the local and state level. The issues related to election security, whether that's foreign interference or voter suppression of the kind that Trump is sort of betting the farm on. Much of that is handled at the state level. So we've started now, I think in the last few years, to make a comeback, flipped a bunch of governor's races and have the chance in this coming election to flip a large number of state houses to sort of level the playing field. But I think that's a very fair question beyond the economic crisis. How with Obama winning handedly a second term and being such a popular figure, was there more that national figures, especially him, but not only him, could have done to be strengthening local Democratic Party efforts? But back to your question from 5 minutes ago, probably. I think, first of all, we have to win this Senate and the House. We have to win because in order to get ambitious climate change legislation through, we need not only to win the Senate, but sine qua non is we have to win the Senate, but also Vice President Biden's going to have a very tough decision to make about whether to do away with the filibuster, which some of your audience is probably familiar with, namely needing 60 votes, in fact, to get meaningful domestic legislation through. So that's a decision Biden hasn't really spoken on, but Obama, in a major break with Obama's prior position, a week ago called for Biden to end the filibuster because even you could have 55 Senate seats, which we won't get out of the election. We'd be lucky if we can get the 50 or 51. But that wouldn't be enough to pass the kind of, climate change is an existential issue. We've seen, because of Republican boycotting as well, how damaging we see it now in terms of federal benefits in the face of COVID and the Republicans refusing to provide benefits to allow people to feed their family and avoid eviction and so forth. That would be what would greet a President Biden, as you say, if we didn't have a Senate. That said, I think let me just add one qualifier. Foreign policy and executive action as a whole lies, in the hands of the commander-in-chief. So, I think the way you frame the question might be a little extreme. Not everything is lost if we only have, let's say, the House and the presidency, and we can't quite get across the finish line with the Senate. I think if we win the presidency, that's going to carry the Senate with it. It looks statistically like that's quite likely. And we've seen how important it has been just to have half the legislative body in the House in terms of pushing for more benefits for workers and blocking some of the most egregious actions that the Senate, the Republican-controlled Senate want to take.
Samantha,
our entire relationship with other countries lies in the hand of the commander-in-chief. And yes, for budgetary reasons, you need the Senate and the House. But there's an enormous amount that can be done by Vice President Biden if he becomes president to restore relations with our allies, to get the relationship with China that's spiraling out of control back in a more strategic.
But what happens? What happens? Because many people, having seen Trump operate, begin to wonder, even if he does lose in November, isn't he going to try to find an excuse not to hand over? Do you have fears about that?
Terrified. It's a great weight loss scheme. Have Trump be your incumbent president. In what are we now? August, almost mid-August, 2020. Less than 3 months till the election. No, I can't sleep. Every day he's doing something new, and he's raising an awful lot of money. The latest scheme, as you know, is to delegitimate the vote. So say that mail-in voting is illegitimate, even though 5 states have done it effortlessly without anybody ever talking about it, even though Trump himself has used mail-in voting to vote in Florida, as have most of his family members. So delegitimate it so when he loses, he can say, oh, I said all along this was a fraud. But second, and maybe even more nefarious, he's now seeking to defund the post office. And so at a time of COVID, but even if you didn't have COVID, more and more states in the U.S. are relying on mail-in voting. It's just more efficient. It's very reliable. There's been no meaningful fraud or credible fraud allegations that make any of Trump's claims legitimate. And now what he's seeking to do is ensure that the ballots don't arrive in the mail on time, because in many states, the laws require that the ballot be received by Election Day. So not just postmarked, but received. And if you have mass layoffs at the post office, which is what Trump is trying to ensure, then you could see people not even receiving their ballot to vote until after the election. He has the places where this matters most are the swing states, and our election just comes down to a handful of states, because some states are deep blue Democrat and some states are deep red and are not going to change no matter how Trump handles the coronavirus or the economy. But this is I think we have reason to be very worried. That said, it's not like Joe Biden is asleep at the wheel here. He's got teams of lawyers. The Democratic National Committee are hiring up all across the country. And this just makes the get out the vote effort to get people, young people, seniors and others registered, to get them their ballots early. All of that sort of voter enthusiasm, if it can be channeled in many places virtually, toward actually getting people to just work around this new set of constraints that Trump is seeking to impose. We do have enough time still to sort of accept that this is his, not accept it, fight it, but to take note of the fact that this is his play, and then get people their ballots early, make sure that they've submitted them, give them stamps if that's what's required. Just take away as many of the hurdles as you can, knowing that Trump is continuing to try to erect more.
It's terrifying.
Definitely.
How much damage has Trump done to America's authority in the world?
Well, I could start by asking you, because I think my impression, I know there are some Trump supporters in Ireland, but by and large, people are flabbergasted and somewhere between flabbergasted and horrified. And I think what has been so damaging, is to just see the way everything he did before, attacks on the media, attacks on judges, cozying up to dictators, trashing Angela Merkel and the mayor of London and our closest allies, being extortionist at NATO and with the Republic of Korea and Japan. It's just how to lose friends and alienate people. Like it's like the Dale Carnegie book, in reverse. There's all of that, but I think nothing has been as devastating as the handling of the coronavirus. Is to, for people around the world to see America, the home of X number of Nobel Prizes for science and medicine, the home of Silicon Valley, the country that sent the man to the moon, whatever Trump's own personal autocratic tendencies, to just see this leadership crisis and the human consequences of it. But these are consequences not only felt by the 165,000 Americans who've already died of COVID, tens and thousands of whom, could have been saved by earlier lockdowns or by a consistent message from the White House about wearing masks, about taking precautions, or just by competent testing scheme and contract tracing. But it's, so I think people on the outside are looking in and just saying, oh, that's America? Like, where did America go? How is it possible that America, which used to lead the world in a whole series of areas, is now leading the world in corona deaths and corona infections and unemployment, or economic standstill out of corona? How is that America? But the thing is, it's not only something where people can afford in the rest of the world to just feel pity, as I think Fenton wrote powerfully in the Irish Times. Yes, feel some pity for Americans, but it affects the rest of the world. How is the rest of the world's economy going to recover for as long as we have somebody who puts their own personal interests and their own stubborn devotion to like crazy cures for corona above fixing this problem? For as long as the American economy is in the grip of COVID, the global economy is at our mercy on one level.
And in terms of the balance geopolitically, the damage to America's authority has allowed certainly the Chinese to up their game.
Yes and no. I mean, I think what I was starting to say was just that I happen to have a chapter in the book, The Education of an Idealist, which is called When America Sneezes, because I used to hear this from the Latin American ambassadors. You know, when America sneezes, we catch a cold. And I never thought of it so literally as I do now in COVID, but in terms of the knock-on effects of our dysfunction, you know, for a country like yours or really anywhere in the world, and to pull out of the World Health Organization. Which is a good segue to your question about China. I mean, the U.S. retreat over this 4 years, culminating in the retreat from leadership and indeed the show of every dimension of the wrong leadership in the face of this pandemic, has created a huge vacuum that China has stepped into. And so they haven't wasted any time. They're seeking to extend their influence. They're the old Chinese Communist Party saying about hide your capabilities and bide your time. No more of that. No biding of time, no hiding of capabilities. It's an onslaught. I think you've seen liberal democracies, even though most of them are also very inward focused, constituting coalitions now to sort of fend that off a little bit. And they've been more effective lately than they were in the early years of the Trump years. I think that for a time it was such shell shock people were so accustomed in Europe and elsewhere of the U.S. being this kind of flawed but catalytic player, you know, within international institutions and fora that it took a while to sort of say, okay, they're not going to be doing that now. We better get going. So I do think there've been, you know, some positive shifts in terms of other democracies stepping up and recognizing that there is more safety in numbers. But that has come late.
Is that what makes you hopeful right now? Because I know you're a hopeful person.
Well, Amos Tversky, the great Israeli psychologist, said, never be pessimistic, because if you're pessimistic, you suffer twice. Once on the front end, once when the bad thing happens. It's about the most pessimistic thing you could say. But no, I mean, I'd say to finish the point on China and then to say what makes me hopeful, China has overstepped. I mean, China used to say that its model was one where it provided assistance, infrastructure, help, loans with few strings attached. And now the amount of bullying and coercion that China is practicing internationally, yes, it's providing PPE, masks and gloves and things that people need desperately in developing countries, the kinds of places where the U.S. used to be very active. Yes, it's leading on a vaccine and trying to get that vaccine to developing countries, but it's all at a price. It's immensely transactional. So one of the things that gives me hope is that this overstepping means that there will be an opening, I think, to a President Biden if he's elected and if Trump can be dislodged from the place where he has become very comfortable. And so I think liberal democracies coming together, there's more of an understanding, not of the niceness of alliances, but of the acute necessity of alliances in an age of China's rise. And as China seeks to export its autocratic model to different parts of the world, I think that hunkering down together, sharing best practices on fighting misinformation and dealing with cyber threats together and standing firm for human rights. I think all of that is going to become sort of glue in the post-January 2021 world if we can get there. The second thing that gives me hope is a broader point that starts in what I see in the US in terms of the amount of political engagement and political activism. Of course, we see it in the Black Lives Matters movement, but we also see it in voter registration efforts. I see it on the college campuses that I visit, whether in person or virtually now. And you see that playing out all around the world. There were more protests in 2019 than at any time in recorded history. Many of them rooted in a sort of disgust with the corruption that many elites are believed to have practiced. And if Vice President Biden can win, I think there's a hunger, again, for countries to stand for, yes, human rights, but also to stand for a kind of integrity, equality, which has been lacking, as policy after policy has just widened income gaps, but also to stand for the fight against corruption, which has driven so many people into the streets. So that opening and the sense that young people have had enough of kind of allowing decisions to be made for them climate is the best motivator of young people, but not the only one. So in some ways, like, this is how we change. Certainly in America, we don't change generally, at least for the good, in a top-down way. We have changed in our history because of bottom-up movements, and then being met with political action that gives rise to different kinds of leadership. And I think that's true in lots of parts of the world.
When you were before the Senate hearing to approve you as the UN ambassador for the United States, you quite pointedly kept answering questions with the phrase, "America is the greatest country in the world." And it was quite a clever thing to do. Do you still believe America is the greatest country in the world?
Well, I mean, what I would say is America still retains, as we saw in the midterm election in 2018, as we see in, again, the amount of voter enthusiasm, even against the backdrop of the lockdown and the devastation of the pandemic. There's this bottom-up hunger here, and without ranking countries, which I'm not going to do here. I'm not on the stand, so I don't have to survive that. And I will say, in writing about that, I'm of course writing with embarrassment that I went on autopilot in that way, but also exposing what that process is often like and how it's all about sound bites and so forth. But I think that what is remarkable about America, I think there are two features that give rise to an incredible resilience. The first is this tradition of protests. I mean, the fact that people are going out and risking their lives, yes, in many cases, if not most cases, wearing masks and so forth, but for the sake of saying we're not going away as long as police violence against African Americans continues at scale in this way, as long as the structural causes of racism in America continue to go unaddressed. Like, we're not going anywhere. We're not leaving. And being joined by mothers in Portland, Oregon, and students and others, and it's just incredible. So that those traditions of bottom-up protest that I've alluded to, I think, are an amazing feature. The second, which Trump has actually stripped, if you can believe it, from the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service slogan, but is that we are a nation of immigrants, and we bring the resourcefulness and innovation and diverse ways of thinking and diverse traditions into our borders in a way that creates an electricity that I think, again, these two things of citizen action and this kind of melting pot of talent and resourcefulness from all over the world are two pillars of this resilience. And so, with a change in leadership, and if the people who come to the streets, this sort of gets to one of the questions you were asking earlier, don't think to themselves, okay, Biden's got this, we're good, but they view this next period almost like a permanent campaign. And where they don't leave the streets and they continue to hold people in power, their feet to the fire, I think we could get back on track. And whatever about national rankings, I'm pretty impressed with New Zealand these days, I'll say, but I can't visit because of their airtight lockdown policies, and because of the fact that an American passport no longer gains you entry to much of the world because of the mishandling of Corona.
Your passport will always be valid here, I would imagine. Ambassador Power, thank you very much.
Olivia, thank you so much for doing this.